Could I welcome everyone to the 7th meeting of 2020 of the Social Security Committee. Can I remind everyone to turn mobile phones or other devices to silent or to switch them off so it doesn't disrupt our meeting. We've got one apology this morning. Unfortunately, our Deputy Convener Paul McNeill can't be with us this morning. We've already had agenda item 1, which was in private earlier this morning, so we move to agenda item 2 on subordinate legislation. The committee will take evidence on the first tier tribunal for Scotland Social Security Chamber procedure and allocation of functions amendment regulations 2020 draft, which is subject to the affirmative procedure. Can I remind members that both instruments that we'll be considering today were circulated to members on the 31st of January for their attention? And can I welcome the Cabinet Secretary for Social Security and Older People, Shirley-Ann Somerville. Thank you for coming along this morning, Cabinet Secretary. And can I also invite Anne McVeigh, Deputy Director of Social Security Policy, and Jane McAteer, Cross-Cutting Policy Manager, both from the Scottish Government. Thank you everyone for coming along. And can I ask the Cabinet Secretary to make an opening statement?
Thank you, Convener, and thank you for the invitation to attend today. I'll keep my remarks on this relatively brief. As part of our commitment to continuous improvement, we have listened to feedback and used this to make further improvements to our appeal system. We have always been clear that people will have the right to challenge decisions made by Social Security Scotland and that process should be as simple as possible. The new Social Security Chamber is key to realising that right by ensuring that people have access to justice in a timely manner in line with our principles of dignity, fairness and respect. Firstly, the regulations that are being considered today make an adjustment through Regulation 2 to the allocation of function regulations by extending the period of assignment for the acting Social Security Chamber President. We want to ensure that our appeals process continues to be managed effectively and, most importantly, secures for people an appropriate means of redress when challenging decision. That is why we believe it's appropriate to retain the expertise and experience of the current Chamber President at this time to inform the challenging appeal process arising from the ongoing delivery of assistance in Scotland. We have also taken the opportunity to make amendments to the procedures regulations which govern the operation of the Chamber. These are partly to clarify the intent of the original drafting and partly to address more substantive points. The provisions that have been amended cover seeking appellant views on hearings, appropriate publishing of Chamber decisions and procedures around case review and case dismissal. Regulation 3.2 clarifies that where a case has been dismissed as a result of a failure to comply with an order in relation to the conduct of proceedings, reinstatement may only be sought where there is good reason for failure. Regulation 3.3 removes the requirement for an appellant to give views on whether an oral hearing should be held at the time of submitting a notice of appeal. This will allow an individual to give their views on hearings at a more appropriate time in the appeal process. Regulation 3.5 and Regulation 3.6 together allow the publication of summaries of Chamber decisions which provide updates on matters of interest and points of law arising in decisions without compromising the identities of individuals. Regulation 3.7 provides that it is usually the legal member who is to undertake a review of a decision, rather than this being a free choice between the legal or an ordinary member. Regulation 3.8 has the effect of clarifying that Social Security Scotland review requests are also treated as applications for permission to appeal unless stipulating otherwise. This will ensure all parties are on an equal footing. I want to be clear that we're seeking to amend these provisions in order to further augment our right-based approach by putting the individual right at the heart of the process and removing barriers to challenging decisions. In the course of amending these regulations, we consulted the President of the Scottish Tribunals and former members of the Judicial Reference Group, and I am pleased that they were approved without comment. I wish to thank and acknowledge the support provided by the Judicial Office, whose advice and guidance was invaluable through this process. And of course, happy to take questions.
Thank you very much, Cabinet Secretary. Just for members' information, in the next agenda item, if there's any particular comments, there's an opportunity in what is a brief debate, if required, at the next agenda item. So at this point, if there's any questions for the Cabinet Secretary?
Just for
yes,
clarification, Convener, on Regulation 3.5, I was just reading the explanatory note, which says it removes the option for a decision of the Social Security Chamber to be published. So I just wonder if you could explain why that would be. Why would you not publish a decision?
Well, the challenge here is to ensure that there is the confidentiality for the individuals concerned. So there is an area where if something is published, that it may not be possible to anonymise the appellants when publishing the decision in full. So what we're particularly looking at here is through the summaries of the Chamber decisions, they'll provide updates on the matters of interest and the points of law. So we're getting the information that's required, but we're absolutely ensuring that those there's no danger to the individual, to ensure that there's an opportunity for them to be recognised as that process goes through.
Okay. Thank you.
Are there any other questions? Okay, that concludes agenda item 2. So we move to agenda item 3 on the same matter, and can invite the Cabinet Secretary to move motion S5M 20851.
Moved, Convener.
Okay, as I said, if there's the thirst for a debate in relation to this matter, now's the opportunity for members. Anyone wants to make a comment at this stage? Anything in summing up that non-debate, Cabinet Secretary?
No, thanks, Convener.
Okay, so the question is that Social Security Committee recommends that the First Tier Tribunal for Scotland Social Security Chamber Procedure and Allocation of Functions Amendment Regulation 2020 be approved. Do we recommend this for approval?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. We will now suspend briefly. We now move to agenda item 4, which is still on subordinate legislation, and the committee will take evidence on Social Security Advocacy Service Standard Scotland Regulations 2020, which is subject to the affirmative procedure. Can I again welcome Cabinet Secretary for Social Security Older People, Shirley Ann Somerville, and her officials, Fiona Campbell, Act Implementation Team Leader, and Simon Coote, Legislation and Operational Policy Unit Head, both from Scottish Government. You're very welcome this morning. And can I again ask the Cabinet Secretary to make an opening statement?
Thank you, Convener. The Scottish Government is required by Section 10 of the Social Security Scotland Act 2018 to make independent advocacy support available to people with a disability who need such support to engage effectively with Social Security Scotland as part of the process of claiming Scottish Social Security assistance. The Act does not define disability. It is for individuals to self-identify whether they are eligible for advocacy support as provided by the Act. This may include deaf people and those with a sensory disability or mental health condition. Section 11 of the Act requires Scottish ministers to develop and publish service standards that would apply to this support. Services providing advocacy support on behalf of Scottish ministers must undertake to comply with those standards. The standards were published and the regulations covering the standards introduced on the 31st of January. My apologies. The service standards apply to individual instructed advocacy. Instructed advocacy takes place where the individual is able to tell the advocacy worker what they want as well as the actions they would like taken. This means that the individual can understand the advocacy role, how the advocacy worker can represent and support them, and that they can instruct their advocacy worker. The standards were based on existing material and an initial version was tested with a small number of services and service users in winter 2018. A short life working group was then established and they refined this work ahead of the public consultation which ran over autumn 2019. 77 responses were received to the consultation and the key issues raised were around the application of the standards to instructed advocacy and also the definition of independence. Given our advocacy support is for people claiming benefit entitlements, it was considered appropriate to limit this to instructed advocacy. The service is for when an individual is able to tell the advocacy worker what assistance they require and what outcomes they are seeking. Translation, interpretation or other communication support can be provided to assist individuals to instruct an advocacy worker. An individual with severe and/or complex communication needs and who was not able to claim assistance in their own right or instruct an advocacy worker would have a person acting in a legal capacity, for example, an appointee or a guardian, to make benefit claims for them. When we discuss what we mean by an independent advocacy service, there has been some debate around the definition of around the definition of independence used. For example, this was raised at the Delegated Powers and Law Reform Committee when it considered the regulations and standards. Section 10(4)(b) of the Social Security Act makes clear that advocacy services are independent if they are provided by persons other than ministers. I appreciate that this is not the definition used by the independent advocacy sector. However, we will be moving forward using the definition as determined by the Act. We consider that welfare rights and advice organisations, for example, could provide advocacy as long as systems and processes are in place to ensure separation of support and the avoidance of conflict of interests. So the standards set out this requirement and make clear that the advocacy worker should only provide advocacy support. To be clear, the standards include provision to minimise any potential conflicts of interest which could negatively impact on service users, and we will monitor this aspect of the contract during its operation. The standards document provides a definition of advocacy and sets out the standards under the principles of independence, person-centred, accessible, trained and quality assured. These behaviours apply either to a service as a whole or to the advocacy worker providing the support. As the committee is aware, the Scottish Government has been running a procurement exercise for the provision of advocacy support. The invitation to tender was issued last December and the closing date for return tenders was the 20th of February. We have received 3 tenders and they are now being evaluated, and we aim to identify the preferred bidder in early May. Once the contract is awarded, the service provider and officials will agree a mobilisation plan which will ensure that advocacy support is available from the end of June. This is in advance of the delivery of the devolved disability benefits. However, I would emphasise that advocacy support is not limited to claims for disability benefits. It will be available for all Scottish Social Security benefits if the individual needs advocacy support.
Thank you very much, Cabinet Secretary. And before we move to questions, I'm conscious that Mr Arthur, Mr Balfour and Mr Simpson were previously on the DPLR committee, and I know they miss it deeply and wish they were still there, but that's parliamentary fate. We now move to questions. Any questions, Mr Balfour?
Good morning, Cabinet Secretary. Just a couple of quick questions. I welcome the statement you've made today, and particularly around Principle 2 of independence. I just wonder if I could firstly ask you, how do you see this being signposted for a claimant? Will it, because obviously you've got to know about the advocacy service to be able to access it, and how do you see that rolling out? The second question is around regard to the Social Security Scotland agency, and on paragraph 1 of Principle 2, you say that they won't be seen as independent. There's been some conversations about when someone goes to make an initial claim that the agency may help the claimant fill the form out. And would you see that as an advocacy role and thus legitimate? Or would you see that the agency, if somebody says, I need help filling out the form, should then be signposting them to a different organisation? I think some clarification around that would be helpful. Thank you.
Well, it's certainly not the role of the agency to provide advocacy work. They are there to provide pre-application support. So if people have questions around the application, the type of information that it may be beneficial to have as they move forward with an application, or some assistance filling in a form, then that is what a local delivery person is there for, or a client advisor if it's by phone. They are certainly not there as advocates, and that's a very, very separate and distinct role for someone out with the agency to take part in. In terms of how we'll be moving forward, I mean, you're absolutely right. There's no point in having this service if people don't know about it, and it really ties into the work that we're doing in general on social security around ensuring that people know their rights and know what's available for them to be able to access those rights. Now, people can obviously self-refer to these aspects, but there will be, for example, a role for the local delivery or for client advisors to be able to suggest to people and tell people as they move forward about the fact that this resource is available to them, and that if they self-declare as disabled, then a person would be able to access that. There's also, of course, important work that we'll need to do with wider third sector, welfare rights advisors, citizens' advice, etc., so that they know if a person is coming to them for advice, that there is also a right for someone who says that they are disabled to access advocacy as well. So there's a responsibility on government to ensure that we are working well with the wider stakeholders that we have, so that they know that this is available and they can encourage people who come forward to them to be able to access that service.
Thank you.
Okay, Alison Johnson.
Thank you. Can I ask how advocacy services will be able to demonstrate or be asked to demonstrate that they meet the standards required?
Well, it's very, very important that there is aspects around quality assurance, for example, and knowing that people have a high quality of service available. We will, of course, have a monitoring and evaluation of the service delivery and the standards that will be addressed through the contracting process. So, for example, around quarterly monitoring meetings, and the service provider will obviously know what's required of them. We'll look at that very carefully as we move forward, because this is a brand new service. It's a brand new tendering contract that's moving forward. So we would, of course, look to see whether there's any lessons learned as we move forward for review. It's important around what we see as success. An independent advocate may provide exceptionally high quality advocacy for an individual. They still might not get a claim at the end of the day, but that's not a reference to say that the advocacy work wasn't good. That's to do with the eligibility of the individual. So as with all of this, we're very conscious about what we measure and how you measure success and what it means for that individual, to make sure that we're driving good practice, good behaviour, encouraging exceptionally high quality standards.
Yeah, I mean, that understanding of what success looks like is obviously key, and I'd just like to, if you could perhaps elaborate on how involved the advocacy sector were in the development of these regulations.
Well, there was a great deal of work that went on during the process. I mean, we had, as I mentioned in my initial opening remarks, a group who looked specifically at this. What they were looking at was already based on much of the advice and standards that are out there previously. They've refined that. We've then moved forward, obviously, to the public consultation exercise, where again there was feedback from those already involved in advocacy work to see how they felt that fitted, and were we driving up standards to ensure that what everybody wanted as we passed this as part of the bill was actually what was going to happen. Obviously, as we've moved through to the tendering part of the process, then there has to be, in some ways, a separation of those who may tender for something to the actual tender process itself. So that's a clear distinction. But up until that point, as the standards themselves were being developed, there was very, very long ongoing work in a kind of iterative process that moved forward to what we got to the consultation, and then what was obviously changed after the consultation to take part and to take account of some of that feedback.
Thank you. Thank you.
Graham Simpson.
Thanks, convener. I think one of the concerns is only a slight concern, really, is that if you're awarding a contract for independent advocacy services, how independent can they be if they're funded by the same people that they're helping people make claims to?
Well, you're quite right to absolutely demonstrate that there's a clear separation on those aspects. So what the role of government is to ensure that the standards are there and that the tender contract has been went through with due diligence, and that people understand how we monitor and evaluate. The decisions that take part in that have absolutely nothing to do with government, and can't be, nor should they be, part of that monitoring and evaluation process. So that's why success is not measured in a way that might even insinuate that there's a link between the government who funds this and actually what an advocate themselves would do. And that's why it's very important that that separation is very clear, that the tender is there to ensure that there's a high quality of provision right across Scotland and that there's the same level of service across Scotland. What happens on an individual basis has absolutely nothing to do with government.
And it was clear in the tender process that whoever wins that tender is not answerable to yourself or Social Security Scotland.
They're simply answerable to ensure that the standards are being met, but that actually has nothing to do with the decisions that are happening or the advocacy support that they are providing in terms of what they're saying or what an individual is asking them to do.
Right. Okay.
Are there any other questions? Okay, thank you. There being no other questions, we'll now move to agenda item 5. And can I invite the Cabinet Secretary to move motion S5M 21021?
Moved.
Again, we have the opportunity for debate, should members wish it. I see Mr Balfour indicating. Would you like to...
I mean, thank you. I mean, I think these are helpful regulations, and I think the clarification given by the Cabinet Secretary this morning has also been helpful. I suppose I would just still raise, I still have a slight concern about the agency being able to fill out the form with the claimant in regard to advocacy, because we have heard in evidence from a number of witnesses over a number of different issues about the importance of getting that information right first time. And I do slightly struggle to see how one member of an agency can give advice to somebody in regard to a claim that they're making, and then that advice to be then reviewed by a colleague. Now, I appreciate there will be Chinese walls there, but that does leave me with slight concern, and I think it's something both the Scottish Government and the Parliament need to just have a look at going down the road in the future, because my own personal view would be that filling out the form should be done by the CAB or advice shop or the new thing, rather than by giving that advice from the agency. Having said that, I think the comments made by the Cabinet Secretary earlier have given me more reassurance, and I, in general, do welcome these, and I do hope that it will make a difference to the number of appeals that we see longer term, that if we get it right earlier on, then there will be less of a need for appeals. Thank you, Commissioner.
Keith Brown?
Yeah, I think it's a legitimate concern, although I have to say that is there a difference between an advice agency, which is part funded by the Scottish Government, filling in that form as well. You could take it to those lengths if you're looking for a conflict of interest. And I do think there's an extent to which the very fact that somebody is working with Social Security Scotland, that for many people will provide a reassurance about standards. So I'm not dismissing the fact there's a concern there, but how far would you take it, and where else would you start to get that level of advice and advocacy if you had to purge everybody that had any kind of connection with either the Scottish Government or Social Security Scotland? So I'm relaxed on it, and I do think that going back to a previous discussion that we had, if you have people providing the advocacy who know the system inside out, then the chance of having a more efficient process is increased, because you won't have this, or you may be able to prevent that number of appeals and the lengthening of the process, which should be to the benefit of everybody concerned.
Are there any other comments? Mr Balfour, you're welcome to come back in if you wish. Any other comments from members? Cabinet Secretary, you get the opportunity if you wish to sum up, given that there was a brief debate there.
So I will just again stress there is very much a difference between advice and advocacy, and advocacy workers in any shape or form are not there to provide advice, whether that's to recommend a course of action, but they're there to support the service user to determine what actions they wish to take place. So there's a very clear difference between advice and advocacy in general. That aside, I absolutely do see the point that Jeremy Balfour is making around ensuring that the role of local delivery and client advisor and supporting clients is one that's clear and recognised, and also the fact that we should continue, obviously, to support people to access advice from Welfare Rights Advisor, Citizens Advice Bureau, if that's what they deem appropriate. So I absolutely do see the point that he's making on that, and I'm sure it's something that we'll come back to as the local delivery staff become further and further in place across Scotland.
Okay, Thank you very much. So that ends the short debate. So the question is that motion S5M 21021 that the Social Security Committee recommends the Social Security Advocacy Service Standard Scotland Regulation 2020 be approved. Are we content to approve the instrument? Okay, thank you. Well, all that remains me to do is to thank yourself, Cabinet Secretary, and both sets of officials for coming along this morning. And we now move into... No, we don't move into that private session. You'll be delighted to hear that ends today's committee meeting. Thanks. We now close the meeting.